You'll remember last week's reading, which was Easter Sunday, we heard the story of the women going to the tomb and finding it empty and meeting an angel and going back to the other disciples and telling them over and over again what they had seen, and the disciples over and over again didn't believe it. The reading today is later on that same day. So we haven't gone very far, but this is what happened next in the story. This is Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Listen to these words and listen to how God is speaking to you today through them. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We have no children here with us today, so we're going to go on to our special music. That was great, y'all. That was so fun. It had been 3 days since Jesus died. And just this morning, the women came from an empty tomb claiming to see angels. Their words indicated that Jesus may be alive, but how could that be? If any held hope for Jesus' return, it would have included a grand spectacle, for sure. You know that song, He Arose, that we sing sometimes at Easter? Up from the grave he arose. You want to sing it? Yep. With a mighty triumph for his foe. Yeah. He arose a victor from the dark domain. Yeah. He arose. Yeah. That's how it had to have happened, right? Super Jesus pushed that stone right off, popped up out of the grave. He had big muscles and a cape, probably. That's how it needed to happen. But it didn't. We read in the scriptures that it was the exact opposite of that. All they had was these women who kept talking about that empty grave and the angel, and otherwise it was pretty darn quiet. The disciples kept telling them that was a ridiculous story. A couple of the men had seen the empty grave too, so something had to have happened. So as two of Jesus' apostles walked along, a quiet stranger joined them. He listened before he talked. But he had a little fun with them too, didn't he? He asked them, as if he didn't know, what they were talking about. And they said this, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know what just happened?" And Jesus says, "What things?" So they explained it to him. You know that term mansplaining? When a man assumes there's no way a woman can know about this subject, so he tries to educate her. This is disciple-splaining. They're trying to tell Jesus all about what happened. He couldn't possibly know the story as well as them, so they lay it all out. They say the things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. But we had hoped. That's the line that always gets me. Jesus seemed like the one. He was so great, and we need someone to redeem this place, to save our people from what we were enduring. We had hoped, which implies, of course, that now we don't have that hope anymore. There was all this other stuff about an empty grave, but it didn't make any sense. All they knew is that he was gone. I wonder if it's ever happened to any of you that you had hoped for something so much, something that you needed desperately, and you had hoped to the point that you really believed it was going to happen, and then it was taken away. Years ago, I spoke to a couple who struggled with infertility, and they finally got pregnant, and it looked like it was going well. And a few months in, they lost that child. But we had hoped. There was a single mom who was living in a rough part of town, working a couple jobs to pay her bills and care for her kids. And she had saved and saved to try to get a better house, and then had a catastrophic car accident. The car was totaled. She couldn't get to work. Her son was hospitalized. The money was gone, as was the possibility of getting out of their neighborhood. But we had hoped. Maybe you've been there with a job interview, with a relationship, with another possibility, and you know that feeling. Hope was fleeting, and it was for the disciples during those days. So after listening to his followers tell him all about himself, Jesus finally responded to them. "Oh, my friends, you have so much to learn. This is just what the prophet said would happen." And he started teaching them, as he'd been teaching them for the past 3 years, only he started from the beginning. He went all the way back to Moses and explained what it all meant. And it felt good to listen to this stranger. He obviously knew what he was talking about, and his voice was rich and familiar. Maybe there was room for that hope to come back after all. The time came for them to part, and the travelers implored him to join them for the night. They sat together and blessed their bread and shared it, and only then did they recognize that the stranger they had been walking with was indeed Jesus himself. And immediately they realized that their hearts had been burning throughout their journey. They had recognized him sort of, but they didn't realize it until that commonplace, unspectacular, day-to-day act of eating together. Their eyes were open at last. After literally years of not understanding completely, the disciples got it. It was starting to come together. The things that he had said and taught and done, even his suffering and death, it was starting to make sense. And all it took was sitting together at the dining room table. Jesus could have returned with armies of angels, with dazzling bright light and trumpets and choirs filling the sky. He could have conquered the world in a grand display of power and show, but instead Jesus showed up in the most mundane of events, a meal. We look for Jesus in grand spectacles. We look for miraculous signs, spectacular events. We seek large gestures of power. But Jesus doesn't only show up in moments like that. Jesus wakes us up as we eat, as we walk, as we talk. Jesus becomes known as we share with one another, as we celebrate being in community. Sometimes we don't realize it until later. And sometimes we're blessed to recognize Jesus in that very moment. Jesus is always there. Jesus is always here. We only need the eyes to see. This is our good news. Our hope is not lost. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen.